Hey, Bobby here from Foundry, and let's talk about the clock hands coding challenge. It's described like this. Given two integers, an hour and a minute, write a function to calculate the angle between the two hands on a clock representing that time. Now, this has been asked of several students during the interview process, and I think this coding challenge is more math than actual code. So what I thought we would do is go over the math behind this challenge, then jump into Visual Studio and write a console application with C# to show how we could solve this application. And if you stick around, we're going to write a Blazor application that would give a UI to this coding challenge, something that you could send to an interviewer to set you apart in the interview process. Now, the first thing I always ask myself when I get any kind of coding challenge is, what do I know based on the description that was provided? Well, in this case, I know a clock face is a circle, and I know a circle has 360 degrees. And I also know there are 12 hours on a clock, and there's 60 minutes on a clock as well. And also know I can take two inputs, an hour and a minute. And finally, I know that I need to return the angle representing the time given. Now, the first thing I want to do is calculate the angle of the minute hand. Now, the minute hand on our clock here is the red line we see pointing up towards the 12. The question I have is, how do you calculate the degree per minute? Well, what we can do is we know a clock has 360 degrees. And if we divide that by the total number of minutes on a clock face, which is 60, 360 divided by 60 will give us 6, or 6 degrees per minute. We can use this to calculate the degree for any given minute, simply by taking the degree of 6 and multiply it by the minute given, and this will give us our minute hand angle. Let's see how this works out as we walk around a clock. Now remember a formula here. 6 degrees times the minute given gives us our angle of the minute hand. Now when it starts out here at 3 o'clock, our red line is pointing directly to 12, and that is 0 minutes. So 6 degrees times 0 will equal a 0 degree angle. If the time happened to be 3:15, now we can take our 6 degrees and multiply that by 15 minutes, and that gives us an angle of 90 degrees. If the time is 3:30, we can say 6 times 30 minutes equals 180 degrees, and if it's 3:45, we can take 6 degrees times 45 equals 270 degrees. Note, minutes are 0 to 59, and there is not a 60th minute. It starts at 0 and ends at 59. Now that we know how to calculate the minute angle, let's calculate the hour angle. Now our clock here, the gray hand is our hour hand. And so we need to calculate the degree per hour. So we can take 360 degrees divided by the total hours on a clock face, which is 12, and that will give us 30, or 30 degrees per hour. How do you calculate the degree for any given hour? Well, we take 30 degrees times the hour given, and that will give us the angle for the hour hand. Oh, let's walk around the clock with our hour hand to see how this works out. So remember our formula, 30 times the hour equals the hour angle. So at 12 o'clock, our angle is 0. So 30 times 0 is 0, or 0 degrees. At 3 p.m., 30 degrees times 3 is 90 degrees. At 6 p.m., 30 times 6 is 180 degrees. And at 9 o'clock, 30 times 9 is 270 degrees. Note, hours are 0 to 23, and most languages express time as a 24-hour clock. We will have to handle that case in our code. The next thing we need to consider is the clock movement. or how the clock moves as the minutes elapse. Now consider how 3:30 is expressed on a clock. At first glance, it seems to be a right angle or 90 degrees. However, the hour hand moves with the elapsed minutes. So at 3:30, our hour hand is actually halfway between the 3 and the 4. So what we need to do is to add the minutes angle to our hour angle. Remember our two formulas. 6 times the minute is our minute angle, and 30 times our hour is our hour angle. We need to convert the minute angle to degrees per hour. So we do that by taking 6 degrees times our minute and dividing that by 12. And then we have a new hour angle calculation. So we take our 30 degrees times our hour plus 6 degrees times the minute given divided by 12. And that adds in our elapsed minutes to our hour calculation, which will give us the proper hour handle angle. Now that we know how to calculate the hour angle and the minute angle, how do we calculate the angle between the two hands for the given time? What we can do is subtract the hour angle from the minute angle. Our minute angle is 30 degrees, or 30 minutes times 6 degrees equals 180 in the case of 3:30. Our hour angle is 3 p.m. times 30 degrees plus our minute angle, which is 180 degrees, divided by 12, and that equals 105. We can take our minute angle, 180, and our hour angle, 105, and subtract them and get the difference. And that'll give us an angle of 75. And that's the angle between the hour hand and the minute hand. Now notice here, we're taking the absolute value of this subtraction because we always want to show our angles as a positive number. The next thing that we need to consider is for any given time on a clock, a time has two angles, an outside angle and an inside angle. Now the problem wants us to return the angle representing the time. Now consider 7 p.m. Our math would return the outside angle, but it really needs to return the inside angle to properly represent the time. We need to return the smaller of the two possible angles for any time given. Now we know currently our angles are calculated with the absolute value of the hour angle minus the minute angle. But if that angle is greater than 180, we want to recalculate that angle to 360 minus that calculated angle. So for example, let's take 7 p.m. Our minute angle would be 0 minutes times 6 degrees, and that would equal 0. Our hour angle would be 7 p.m. times 30 degrees plus our minute angle divided by 12. In this case, our minute angle is 0, so that would give us a result of 210 degrees. And then we would take the absolute value of our minute angle minus 210, and that would give us the angle between the hands is 210 degrees. Since this is greater than 180, we could recalculate that angle with 360 minus 210, and that would give us an angle of 150. Now, if you are doing other times and you want to test to see if your math is working, add the two angles together and they should always equal 360. So 210 plus 150 equals 360. So let's review. Our angle 1 is the absolute value of our angle calculation, or angle 2 would be the absolute value of 360 minus our angle calculation. Note, we return angle 2 if angle 1 is greater than 180. Okay, so that's the math behind the clock hands coding challenge. Let's jump into Visual Studio and let's write some code. I'll see you there. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio 2022, and what we're going to do is create a C# console application to solve the clock hands coding challenge. So I'm going to create a brand new project. and I'll go pick console app. Click next, and we can just give it whatever name you want. And then I'll click next. And we'll take the defaults here, and we're using .NET 8. Okay, the reason we pick a console application is because if you're using the platforms, the testing platforms like HackerRank, these are always going to be console applications. And so if you've been building web apps or Windows apps or something else and you've never written a console app, it can look a little different. And so you need to get used to writing these so that you can perform when you're asked to write these challenges, all right? So I'm going to delete it, and this is program CS, and so all of our code is going to take place in this one file. And the first thing that we need to be able to do is write a method inside here. So it's pretty easy. We'll say decimal, and I'm going to give it a name. And the reason we're using decimal here is because we know we're doing division. And so when you're doing division, you want to do decimal, otherwise you can get your values truncated. We don't want that to happen. And we know that our method needs to take 2 parameters because that was what the challenge said, right? A function that takes 2 parameters. And our parameters are hour and minute. And for now, we'll just say return 1, okay? Now, the other thing you need to do in this C# program is call this method here. And so I'm going to say var angle equals get angle. That's the name of our method. And then I'm going to give it the values we want. Now I'm going to give it 3 for 3 p.m. and 3:30 or 30 past half past the hour. Okay, so at 3:30, we know this angle is going to be 75 because that's how we tested it in our last session. Okay, the next thing we can do is I can display this to the app, what I want to happen. And we'll use a little string interpolation here to give it a user-friendly message. The angle between the hands is, and that'll just give us a message. You can make the message say whatever you want. So let's test this. This should return 1. See if it works. And here's our console app here. And you can see that the angle between the hands is 1. So our message right there showed up. Kind of cool. So now we have our base kind of skeleton of how to call a method and how to write a method. So now what we need to do is write our actual method. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is calculate our minute degree or minute hand angle. And remember, if you remember, 360 divided by the total minutes on a clock face equals 6. So we can say var minute angle equals the minute that's being passed in times 6. And that'll give us the minute angle or the angle of the minute hand. We can do the same thing for our hour angle. And remember, it is 360 divided by 12 equals 30. So we can say var hour angle equals hour times 30. Okay, so that's the base case scenario that we came up with. But remember, it's a little more complicated than that, in that when an hour and a minute hand move around the clock, the hour moves with the elapsed minutes. And so we need to add in the elapsed minutes back into our hour angle. So we say plus minute angle divided by 12. And that'll add the elapsed minutes into our formula here. Okay. So now we have our minute angle and our hour angle. The next thing we need to do is convert this and find the difference between the 2 angles to get the answer to the solution here. So say math.abs is hour angle minus minute angle. And that'll return our angle which is the angle between the minute hand and the hour hand. Now, the other thing that we found out is in the case of 7 p.m., the outside angle, which this math will return, is the wrong angle. We want the interior angle. And so we might surmise that if it's over 180, return the interior angle. So we can do that real quick. We can say if angle greater than 180, our angle can be recalculated to 360 minus angle. And then finally, we'll come down here and return our angle. So we can test this. This is our base algorithm here. This should work. And so 330 should return 75. So let's see what it does. Look over here, 75, great. Okay. The other thing that it can do is let's check 7 p.m. And I advise you to do a lot of times where you know the answer to. Do the math by hand and then check the times to make sure your algorithm is working. And so I'm going to do 7. This should return 150. We know the outside is 210 based on our math session. So this should return 150, and it does. Great. All right, so that's kind of great. And so this is kind of working. Well, let's step our game up a little bit because we need to do a couple of other things that I think you'll run into. Now, when you're on HackerRank or any of these testing platforms, they're going to put your algorithm through several test cases. And so we need to handle some of these test cases. And the other one that could be passed to you is invalid hours, okay? So you never can assume that even though you say that only send me an hour and a minute, you never know, someone may send you some nonsensical data to your function. So let's check for invalid input. So I'm going to say if hour less than 0 or hour greater than 23 or minute less than 0 or minute greater than 59. Okay, and what we can do here is throw an exception. And we'll say throw, we'll say new argument exception. And then we can just give it a message here, invalid time entered. Okay, so now that we can throw an exception from our method, we can have to call our method in another way. So I'm going to use a try catch block here, and I'm going to move our code in the try block. And now I'm also going to catch it. So this will catch our exception, and then I can display my exception here with console. All right, so this should throw an exception if we enter in a nonsensical hour or minute. So I'm going to do 25 hour. There's no such thing. And this should throw a message and write that message right here. Let's run it. Invalid time entered. Great. Now the other thing that could happen here, and let's do 7, let's make sure it works. And right, 150, great. Now the other thing that could happen here is someone could enter in a time which is valid, but it's not what our math could support, and that's 24 hours. So after 12 p.m. or after 11 a.m., the time goes to 12, and then 1 o'clock p.m. is actually 13, and 2 is actually 14, and 3 is actually 15. Our math currently doesn't handle that. So what we need to do is convert the hours being sent into us into a 12-hour clock before we start our calculations. So we can say if hour, and we'll say greater than 11, because if it's 12, we want to convert it to 0, and then we can say hour equals hour minus 12. Anything else we want to do, and then our math will work for all cases from 0 to 23, okay? And so in this case, if we passed in 15, 30, we would get our angle of 75. And that's exactly what happens. So that's great. Okay, so that is our algorithm here to solve the clock hands coding challenge. Not too bad. Just this much code here and a little bit of validation on the front end, and you've got a really good solution. Well, in the next session, let's take this up to another level where we actually build a UI and an application to show what we can do. And that way you can stand out when you're solving the clock hands coding challenge for an employer. Let's take a look at the app we're going to build in this session. So we're going to build this clock coding challenge app, and it allows you to enter in, say, like 3:30, and it's going to calculate the angle, and it shows the clock hands being moved around. So we're plotting the hands on the clock as well as pushing the degree between the hands. It's also going to be validated, so if we enter in negative numbers here, it'll give us messages and feedback so that we don't get invalid input into our algorithm. But pretty much that's what we're going to do, and this will set you apart in the interview process. Everyone else will be sending console apps. You'll send a full-featured web application that solves this challenge. So let's get started. So we're in Visual Studio 2022 here, and this must be the latest version, like 17.8 or higher, something that supports .NET 8. And right here, we're going to click the Create New Project, and we're going to pick the Blazor WebAssembly standalone app here. Click Next, and just give it a name. We'll click OK. And we're going to pick .NET 8 long-term support, authentication none, and these two check boxes here, sample pages, progressive web app, and do not use top statements unchecked. So click create, and this is going to create us a WebAssembly application, WASM app. We'll let it go through its process here. So now that we've got this in here, let's do a little bit of cleanup and get ready to code up our solution here. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove these pages that it made by default. I know I asked for the sample pages, but I don't want the counter page, and I don't want the weather page. I just want this home page here for me. And I'm going to make a modification to the nav menu here and pull out the nav menu links to those pages. So I'm going to get rid of the weather and the counter page. Then I'm going to come up here and maybe get the brand here and spell that out a little bit, depending on what you named your project. May not be very English legible, just a name. So we'll just give it a good name here. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new folder here. New folder, and I'm going to call it images. And I'm going to drag over an image that we have, and we'll give you access this in the link below in the description of the video. And this is a clock orange, which is just basically, if we view this, if we view this, it will, it's just a clock face that we can see here, right? So this is going to be the background for our clock. And then let's run it and see kind of what it looks like. It should just say, hello world, welcome to your new app. And let's just run it and see what we got. Okay, so we got hello world. We can remove this about link that takes us to learn.microsoft. We could probably get rid of that. And then we got here, but we're all set up and ready to go. So the next step, let's just start coding up our page in here, because all of our app is going to exist inside this home page. All right, so the first thing we need to do is kind of set up our base level page here. And I'll go ahead and add a code block here, because every Blazor app has a code behind here. And this is where we'll write our code that makes our app function. And we can get rid of all of this, and let's just change our page title from home to coding challenge, clock coding challenge. And so in here, inside of every Blazor application, this is just a web page, so we just need some basic HTML in here. So I'm going to add an H1 tag here, and I'm going to say clock coding challenge. This will appear on our page. And I'm going to add an H3 just to give our users some description about what's going on here. Calculate the angle of the hour and minute hands for any given time. Right. Now this could be a broader description about the coding challenge as it's described to you. If they give you a paragraph of text, just put that paragraph of text here in this H3, and I think that'll be great. And I'll say I'm going to give this a row here. We're going to use Bootstrap for this, but you can use anything you want inside of Blazor. So I'm going to make a row, and I'm just going to make 2 columns here. And one column is going to hold our UI, and then the other column will hold our clock. So I'm going to put another column here. Now we want these to go side by side or stack. So defaultly, we want the top ones to stack. So this will make it 12. And then we'll say on large, we'll make our UI 4 wide and then our clock 8 wide. Okay. And so for now, right now, we're going to leave our UI empty here. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to input the HTML that's for the clock. And I'm not going to go over this HTML. I'm also going to bring in the CSS, and I'm not going to go over the CSS either because I want to talk about the Blazor code and not necessarily how I did the clock in CSS. You'll be able to get the full code from us on download from our GitHub repo. But if you want to see how this clock is built, just like and subscribe. And if I get several comments, I'll come back and make a follow-up about how to make the clock with the CSS and the HTML described here. But to save time, we're just going to cut and paste the clock that I built here. And I'm going to add a style sheet to this home page here. So I'm going to say add new item. And here I'm going to select style sheet. And for style sheets, for isolated style sheets, we give it the home dot, has to have the same name, home.razor CSS. And click add. And now we have a style sheet that is isolated to this page. So all the styles that we have in here only affect this page here. Okay. And I'm going to need some CSS for this, which I am just going to cut and paste in. And I'm not going to go over it, but just to know that the whole trick here is this transform statement here and how we transform these hands. And so one thing that we will do in our code is modify this one CSS line here. Everything else in here is how to set these hands up and how to make them behave correctly on breakpoints. Right? There's not a whole lot of CSS here, but if you're really interested, you can look at it. Okay. And also of note here that my background is this clock orange image, and that's over here in my solution. So that's how it's finding it. All right, let's run it and see if we have our clock page, our clock on the page. All right, let's give us our errors here. Oh, okay. So I'm using some variables here to transform my styles. I'm going to take those out for now, and we'll cover that when we get to the Blazor part here. Okay, so now we have our title here, our subtitle, and we've got our clock in the 12 o'clock position. So that looks pretty good. So the next step is to add a form. Okay, now that we got that, let's close that down here. And let's work on our page here a little bit more. And so the first thing I want to be able to do let's get some more room so we can see here, is I want to add some private variables here. And every page, I think, needs to have a page model. So we can call it whatever we want, but for explanation, we're going to call it page model. It can be called whatever. And I want to create a variable that will hold all of the properties in my class for the form. And so we'll create a public class here, and we'll call this page model. Then we'll come back here and we'll say equals new. Okay. Now the page model is going to hold the values in our form that we're going to submit, specifically the hour and the minute. And so we can tell it it's going to be an int, and we'll call it hour. And then we're also going to create one int, and we're going to call it minutes. Okay, we're going to go ahead and give our properties in our model some default values. So we're going to set it up to have 3 as the hour and 30 as the minute. So our default case will be 3:30, the one we've been using throughout this video. Okay, now the other thing that we can do is we can make these fields required, and we can use what's called data annotations to help our form figure out if the values being entered are valid or not. So we need to come up here and add in something. We'll say add using system.componentModel.data annotations. And this will bring this into our page from .NET, and it allows us to mark up our model with some pretty handy features here. So the first thing we can do here is I can make this required. So I'm going to make them both required. And I'm also going to set the range of these values. So there's a range validator. So I'm going to say range, and this 0 to 12. And then we also can put it like this, sorry. And we also can give it an error message. So we can say error message equals, and we'll say hour must be between 0 and 12, because we really don't care about AM or PM. If you were doing a digital clock, which would make this thing useless, it would matter, but in this case it needs to be 0 to 12. We're going to do the same thing here. We'll say range, and we'll say 0 to 59. We'll say comma, error message minute between 0 and 60. All right, so we've set up our model here. We've given it some data validations, and we've also set up default values. So no matter when we run this, we'll have default values. And if someone tries to enter in a value that doesn't hit these rules here, this range rule, it'll throw an error. Kind of cool, all right? All right, so the next thing that we need to do is add a form here. And so now that we have a page model, we can add a form. Now, forms in Blazor are a little bit different than forms in HTML in that we have to specify something called an edit context. And the edit context tells it that our form values consist of what's in our model here. So first off, we want to do is I want to create a variable called edit context. And we'll just say that it's called edit context. All right. So this is a private variable, and then we're going to use this variable in our form. Now the next thing that we need to do is set up what happens when our form starts up. So I'm going to go protected here, and I'm going to create a override void. And there's a lot of these functions that run, and it's called page lifecycle events. And there's a lot of them, but like 7 or so, not a lot, 7 or so. But one of them's on initialized. And the IntelliSense is really good. It tells us what happens here. It says this method is invoked when the component is ready to start. So on initialize, okay? And it's got its initial parameters that then need to be passed in, all right? So it's ready to start. And so what we can do here is on initialize, we can say edit context equals a new edit context, and then we can pass it the type we want, which is PM. So now our edit context has an instance of our class here, right? Then passed into our edit context. So now our form will kind of work. So let's add our UI for our form here. And so I'm going to go into our top column here, and we're going to add a form. And in Blazor, there's some special components that are built in to help us with forms. And one of those is called edit form. And this will replace your traditional form tag that you would have seen in HTML that like you've been coding with before. Now it gets rendered as a regular form. It's just that the component helps us with a couple things. Specifically, we can add an edit context to it and tell it which private variable that we want it to be bound to. So now when we set up our edit context in our form, now we can tell it, hey, here's the values that are going to be in this form. So let's set up a quick HTML for our form, and we'll say div, and it's not much. So we're going to stack a couple of divs on top of each other. And I'm going to just separate them, and this is MB is -3 as a margin. And these two values here, we'll say 3. And then we'll also add another div, stackable div here. And this will hold our submit button. So we'll go ahead and put that in there. All right. So let's get started here. And let's add a little bit of HTML, not too much though. All right, so the first thing we want to do is add a label for this. So I'm going to say label. And I'm going to say for hour, and then I'm going to also give this a class from Bootstrap. And I'm just going to give the label, it's going to say hour. And then here I'm going to add my input. And this is going to be called input number, and it's another Bootstrap built in. And so this will do the same thing as input text type number as you would in HTML, but it gives us some extra controls here. So I'm going to add my Bootstrap class to style it up, control, and we'll give it an ID. And I'm going to give it a bind value here. And what bind value does is pretty powerful. And so what it allows me to do is, as if code is changing down here in my code block, the values of, say, this our variable here that we have in our class, and then it'll automatically change up here in our input. Also, if I change the value in my input here, the user types something in, it's going to change the value back inside of my class. So it's called two-way binding, and all you need to do that is tell it what variable you want it bound to. And that's it. Okay, so let's add, let's copy this and do the same thing for minute. And we'll just call it minute here. Change the label. And then we'll change our bind statement here. And you can see here, because it's type safe, if I hit dot, it knows what the values are. And if I mouse over it, you can see it says int page model. You may not be able to see that, but if you're coding along, what this says is int page model.minute. It knows the type and the variable that this thing is bound to. It can't be anything other than that. All right. So our final piece of HTML here is our button. Nothing special here. We'll make a bootstrap button, BTN, and then we'll just style it with primary and make it blue. Okay, so that's our button, that's our edit form. And so let's run this to see, it doesn't do anything yet, but just see if it comes up on the page for us. Cool, okay. Neat. Let's see if I can enter a -1. Okay. Now I promised you that it would validate, and you can see here it thinks it's green, thinks that's valid, and I entered a -1. And we know that, hey, you added those data annotations. They didn't really work. Okay, well, let's add that to the page, to our form here, and test those out. All right. To do that, what we do is we come in here in our edit form, and we can add a component here called data annotation validator. And if you've ever had to do this with other languages, you're going to like this. So what I do is add this component. Now it's going to validate the form. The question is, where do I put the messages? I can put a group message up. I think that's kind of lazy. So I'm going to make a validation message for each input here. So validation message. And it says for, and it's a little bit of a lambda expression here, but once you get used to writing these, it's the same pattern every time. So this tells it what property that I'm binding for the validation. So when a data validator gets fired, then it knows what message to put here. So it's looking in the class, bringing back that error message in that range, or the default error message for required, and sticking it here. And so we can do the same thing here. And we'll say pm.minute. Boom. So now when we run it, we should have validations running for our code here. And if not, we can do some other things. Okay, so let's try to enter a -1 here. Yep. And so now that validator tells it that it's not valid. And it's marked red and give it styling. You can control the styles and everything, but that it's incredibly simple to set up to give your forms validations. So that's the form. The next step we need to do is when we click calculate, let's actually get our algorithm in place for it to actually calculate the angle. Let's go over to our code here. We'll stop this running. And let's make a new method here, and we're going to call this handle submit. But what this function is going to do, or method, is going to handle when our form is submitted. And every time the button is clicked or other actions, we want this method to run. We also want this to run on initialization right off the bat. So we can go ahead and calculate the angle of our defaults here. So we have defaults set up. So this will run with the defaults in our form. And so it'll calculate it right away so that your user, when they run the app, yeah, it's already got an angle figured out. Cool, it's neat. All right. The other thing that I want to add to our form is I want to add a message that gets displayed up here. Okay, so let's add a H4 here. And I'll just show you another way how two-way binding works. And we can create a variable called message. So I'm going to come down here in my code block here. I'm going to say private message. And then give it a type, and it's going to be a string. We'll say message. And we'll go ahead and set it up as a empty string. And then in here, all I have to do to get the value of this variable in here is just reference it in my markup here. So I'm going to say @ which allows me to write Blazor code here. And it already found it, message. So now anytime this changes, this value will have the new value automatically updated to that page. It does all the DOM manipulation. So we don't have to get a handle to this H4 block or any kind of thing like that. We just change the value here and it happens, right? So let's watch it happen. So I can say message equals hello form. Okay, and what this is going to hold eventually is the angle message that we want coming back from our code. So let's look at that, see if that works. And since this is going to run at startup, we should get hello form on our page right off the bat. And that's what happened. So you can see it right here. It's on the form. So this is where we'll put our message from whatever happens here, okay? So we've got our handle submit built. We've got our message algorithm built. How do we control that and get things to the page? The next thing we need to do is bring in our actual algorithm. So our form is wired up, and now what we can do is bring in our code from our console app, our algorithm for getting an angle. Copy that from our angle here. I'm not going to go over this code because we did that in the previous session here. So I'm just going to pull that in here. I'm going to pull that in as a method straight from there, and I am going to give it a modifier here, private. Okay, and now it is a decimal get angle, and this is exactly like what we just wrote. Okay, it works exactly the same because it's C#, and everything in here is contained based on here, and our function's well designed because it's not looking at outside of anything. All right, pretty neat. All right, so now we need to find a way to call this. All right, so let's go to our handle submit here, the method here, and let's see if we can call it in that message there. Now remember, we did this before. This does have an exception, so we'll go ahead and call it like it was before, and we'll say try, and we'll say var angle equals get angle, and this time to get our value, we don't have to look into our form, we look into our class, and we get hour PM dot minute. I hope I type this right. Okay, now everything's right in the world. The other thing, guys, I can go ahead and put a catch in here. And we'll go ahead and say message equals ex.message. Nice. We also can put a message here. We can say message equals, and then we'll use our string interpolation here. The angle between the hour and minute hands is angle degrees. Something like that. You make it whatever you want. Okay, so now we'll call our method. We'll get the angle. We'll set our message to the page. And let's see what happens. Let's run that. Okay, boom, look at that. The hour angle is 75 degrees. So if we go to 7, remember that one is 1 o'clock. Ooh, nothing happened. Okay. Our form is valid, but nothing happened. And that's because we didn't tell our form to do anything on submit. So let's close that and handle that part. So we'll come back up to our form here. In our form, we can tell it to run code on events. And so one of those events is on valid submit. And we tell it what method to run. Kind of cool. The other thing that we can do here, and of note, me adding this means that this button will trigger this action. So we don't have to register this button with a click event or watch for any kind of event. This will handle all that wiring up for us. So it makes your UIs pretty clean when you're doing this. The other thing that's really kind of cool is we also can run events on our inputs here. And so I'm going to make one called on or at bind value, and then I'm going to give it the event, and then call it after, and we'll call that handle submit as well. And I'm going to change the same one for the minute here. Handle submit. If we scroll to the right and see kind of what it looks like. And so now we have this line of code here. We'll also run our method on this event. And normally you would have to do some sort of JavaScript magic to make these types of things work, have listeners and all that kind of stuff. Blazor's handling that all for us. And so now when we run our form, and so now I can add a 7 here, and when you can just hear that 730 is 45 degrees. I change it to 0, and now it's 150. And then you can decide if you want this to happen on change for each individual element, or you want to run only when the button is clicked. And that's just a design decision of the particular form you're working on. I just want to show you that both will kick off the handle submit function. Kind of neat. All right, so what's left to do? Well, we got to get this clock working. So let's do that next. So a couple things I'm going to do. The first thing I'm going to do is tell you how this works. I've got 2 classes here, hand with hour hand and minute hand, and these are controlled by CSS transforms. And what I'm going to do is pass a inline style to these to rotate this where I want it, okay? So I'm going to achieve that by creating a couple of private strings that's going to hold my transform. So I'm going to say transform hour, and then I'm going to make another one called transform minute. Okay. So this is a pretty powerful pattern that we're using here in Blazor, is that I can pass inline styles based on the value of this string. And so if I change the string in my code, because of two-way binding, it will automatically change that style, which is pretty powerful. Okay. So to achieve that, I just say transform hour, and I also can say transform minute here. So I can just pass my inline style here, and it'll impact this element. All right, so we need to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is let's close this down, handle submit here. Let's get this one here, and then let's write a new method here. Private And then I'm going to call this void. It's not going to really return anything. And we'll call it set clock hands. Set clock hands. And what it's going to take is the H degree, or the hour degree, not the hour entered in, but the degree of the minute hand, and then the degree, or the degree of the minute hand. So the degree of the hour hand, the degree of the minute hand. And we're going to say transform hour, and we can use our interpretation here, and we can give it our string of the CSS that we want here. I'm going to add in my variable here, which is H degree plus 90. Semicolon. Okay, looks a little weird, but it's just making a string. We're using our interpolation to do that. And we'll change this one to minute. And then we'll make sure that this is minute. Cool. So we come in here in our get angle here, and then we can call our clock hands after these hour angles have been created. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to say set clock hands, and I'm going to pass it the angle. So I'm going to say hour angle, minute angle. All right, and now this is set up to change our page here. Now notice one thing here in our handle submit here that I want to change, that we can add in here. Because we have exceptions going on, we can also restrict this from running if someone tries to enter in invalid information. Okay, so we can just say if our edit context dot valid, and then we'll come here, boom, wrap everything in that. Just like that. And that means that this has to be valid before it even tries to run this code. Just the one thing oversight I missed in the little bit, and I saw that. So let's run it. See if our code works. And look at that, it plotted it on our thing. So let's change it to 7, calculate 730. We can change it to 15. We can tab off, it'll change it. We can hit 20 and hit the button and it'll change it. So it kind of works. If we put our negative values in here, it validates it. Still got the old message here, it didn't run. And so then we can change it to 6. And now it changes our degree, and also our clock is now changed. So that's it. So how can you use this? Well, I think you can use this in one of two ways. I think that if you take a coding challenge, either in person or on HackerRank, and you see this coding challenge, or any coding challenge for that matter, build an app and send it back into the hiring manager. So if someone's trying to hire you, they know what the test was they've given out. And you say, hey, I saw this test and I did pretty well on the test, but took a little extra time to build an app here. So that's kind of cool. The other thing that you can use this for is if you bomb an interview. Let's say you go in there and they ask you this question and you freaked out, you had a brain freeze, you couldn't remember it. Take the time to build an app and submit it. I would say submit it in the next 24 hours and say, hey, struggling the interview, but as I thought about it, here's an app solving that. And this is how I would approach take to solve this problem. And what we've seen is even when people bomb interviews, if they take this approach, they can turn a yes or a no into a yes. So build the app, set yourself apart from everyone else. Well, anyway, I hope this helps. Good luck and keep coding.